Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. In a previous video I told you that I believe Gabriel García Márquez's masterpiece is not 100 Years of Solitude, but El otoño del patriarca, or The Autumn of the Patriarch. Now, I did not make that statement just to be original or different or controversial or any of those things. This is something that I actually believe. And as a matter of fact, Gabriel García Márquez was asked once, what is your most important novel? And he said, The Autumn of the Patriarch. He said this was a novel, or the novel actually, that he believed could rescue his name from oblivion. He said it was the novel that he was most happy to write, but at the same time it was also his most difficult novel because it took him 17 years to produce this relatively brief text. It is also his most experimental novel. That is something that I wanted to add. So I think we should really look at The Autumn of the Patriarch, and that's what we are going to do, my friend. The Autumn of the Patriarch was published in 1975, and it is Gabriel García Márquez's fourth novel. Okay, here is how I count that. We have Leaf Storm, An Evil Hour, 100 Years of Solitude, of course, and then The Autumn of the Patriarch. No One Writes to the Colonel is a novella, and then I don't care what Wikipedia says, Leaf Storm is not a novella. Okay, Leaf Storm is a novel. We're going to talk about this sometime in the future, so that is something to look forward to. So at that time, when The Autumn of the Patriarch was published in 1975, most of the important novels of the boom had already been published, but as you know, the movement was still enjoying a lot of popularity, both in Latin America and in other countries. And of course, The Autumn of the Patriarch is also a great example of what we call the dictator novel. Just like one that I have shown you before, Mr. President, or El Señor Presidente by Miguel Asturias. Just like Yo el Supremo, or I the Supreme by Augusto Roa Bastos, we also have El Recurso del Método, or Reasons of State by Alejo Carpentier, and a later novel by Mario Vargas Llosa titled The Feast of the Goat, or La Fiesta del Chivo. But if you ask me, The Autumn of the Patriarch is the best of the dictator novels. Gabriel García Márquez wrote it because he thought that at that point, at least, 1975 or late 1960s, the great Latin American dictator novel had not been written. And you may ask, okay, so what about Mr. President by Miguel Ángel Asturias? Well, García Márquez said that that novel was pésima, okay, which basically means awful. I'm going to give you a little bit more information about this. We are going to explore this towards the end of this video. So let's look at the story that we have in The Autumn of the Patriarch and a little bit about the structure also. When it comes to story, I would have to say that we do not have really a plot here. We have maybe an example of plot of sorts in 100 Years of Solitude, which presents more of a panoramic view, a view of a society. But in The Autumn of the Patriarch, what you get is a more focused approach, and not really a story, but a focus on a person and on a very important theme. We're going to talk about this also in about a minute. The novel is 250 pages long in this English edition. It's a mass market paperback, and it is divided into 6 chapters. There's an image here that was basically the genesis of this novel. García Márquez says that most of his novels begin with an image in his head, a kind of a revelation. And in this case, what he saw was the figure of a very old man, the old dictator, in a palace full of cows. That's how he started thinking about this great text. And going back to the chapters, if you look at all of these, right, each chapter tells basically the same thing, but in a different way. Each chapter, you could say, approaches the same thing from a different angle. What we have here is basically a spiral structure, in the sense that we keep coming back to that same place, right, but at different levels. And I think The Autumn of the Patriarch is probably the best example that I know of what we might call a spiral structure. Then regarding style and mode, okay, we're going to talk a little bit about this also. This may not sound very original on my part, but I'm going to say that the style is Baroque, okay? Now here's the thing, it is Baroque, but it is also a very popular style. García Márquez said that The Autumn of the Patriarch was in fact his most popular novel. He said that there were phrases that you can find in the novel that translators were just racking their brains over how to translate them into other languages. But he said, if you take this to just a regular person, quote unquote, there in Colombia, they know exactly what it means and they know exactly where it comes from and all the nuances that go with it. Now, if you look at the sentences in The Autumn of the Patriarch, the first thing you're going to notice is that they are very long. Okay, most of these sentences, it's not uncommon for one of these to go on for more than one page and sometimes even more than 2 pages. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I got the feeling that that last chapter is actually one sentence only. I am not absolutely sure because I got so lost in the text and in the prose that I cannot really tell you, but I'm pretty sure that that is the case. But speaking of the prose, right, what it does is it just carries you like a river. This is a torrent of text and language. So it's very easy to get lost in a good way in this novel. It's a musical novel. Garcia Marquez was listening to Bela Bartok and also to popular Caribbean music when he was writing this text. So you could say that he was inspired directly by the music and by this mix also, which he called an explosive mix, because you have here a type of synthesis in a way also. This is not magical realism, speaking of the mode, okay, so style and mode, but you certainly have moments of magical realism, maybe brief examples, brief elements of that, but it is not magical realism in the way that 100 Years of Solitude is. And then what we have finally, also regarding the style and the mode, is a kind of multiple monologue, okay? You have many voices here, including the voice of the dictator, becoming mixed, okay, coming together, just merging into each other. So in that sense, I guess you could also say that this is a type of a river. It's a type of stream that carries you. And the themes, right? The themes that The Autumn of the Patriarch treats are basically two. It's an intertwining of these two themes. Garcia Marquez described this novel as a poem about solitude and power, okay? So The Autumn of the Patriarch really explores that connection. In 100 Years of Solitude, you get something like solitude in everyday life. Here you get solitude as it is connected to power. But here's the interesting thing. Gabriel Garcia Marquez said that this is a very personal book. He said that it was his most autobiographical, and he in fact called it a personal confession. That might seem a little bit weird at first. You may think, wow, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was not a dictator. He did not have the mind of a dictator or anything like that. But if you look at The Autumn of the Patriarch at the most personal level of this novel, what Garcia Marquez is doing here is exploring his relationship to fame. He said that the solitude of power and the solitude of fame are very similar. So that is one level at which he could connect with this character of the patriarch. And it has a lot to do, right, this connection right here, with the way that he presents the dictator and also with the way that we as readers respond to this very interesting character. Now, looking at the content, okay, we looked at the preliminaries. Now the question is, what can you find in this novel? Basically, The Autumn of the Patriarch is a description of a typical dictatorship. Okay, this is what the novel presents. Gabriel Garcia Marquez read books about dictators before and while he was writing this novel as a type of research, I guess you could call it. And he also, of course, unfortunately, had the experience of dictatorship in Latin America. So it's both personal and also researched in the sense of a result of reading. The novel is focusing on the patriarch himself, but it presents both the inner world of the patriarch and the outer reality, so both his psychology and the world around him. When you look at this figure, it is really the dictator. He is really larger than life. You could say that he is a type of myth. He is an archetype, but it is very important to point this out. He is also real, like very, very real in this case. We are talking about a situation with this novel where it's not a case of either or, but a case of both. And there are quite a few supporting characters also. It's not all about the dictator. There are the people in his life. And each chapter, each of the 6 chapters that you're going to find in this novel focuses mostly on one of them. For example, there's a chapter on Patricio Aragonés, who was a double of the dictator. There's a chapter on Manuela Sanchez, his first love. A chapter on Rodrigo de Aguilar, his right-hand man. Then there's a chapter on his mother. There's a chapter on his wife and his son. And as you read the novel, the patriarch, you're going to notice, loses each one of these people, so that his solitude increases with each one of these chapters that we are reading. It's one person that is going out of his life until at the very end he is left completely alone. We get a type of apotheosis of solitude in that very last chapter. And going back to the influence of music, it is really quite appropriate when you consider all of this to speak of a crescendo of solitude in this novel until once again we are brought to that climax where the dictator is left completely to himself. Now, given the topic, right, the main topic right here, which is dictatorship, it is hardly surprising that this is in fact a very violent novel. The patriarch, you're going to see, is driven by a personal sense of what justice means. And so he is simply just brutal. Okay, he brutally rules the people in this place, in this nation, this imaginary nation that is all nations in a way. And that brutality reaches just unimaginable heights, especially, I would say, at the end of chapter 3. That ending of chapter 3 is, to me, the most grotesque episode in the novel. If you have read the novel, you know exactly which one I am talking about. And it is the part of the novel that I was not able to forget in all the years since I read it for the first time many years ago for a college course that I took on Gabriel García Márquez. This time I reread it in English to share some ideas with you on it. But even considering the brutality of the novel, I would also say we also have to consider that this is a very pathetic novel. And I mean that in the literal sense of the word pathetic, because what we have here, interestingly and maybe unexpectedly, is a sensitive dictator. Okay, the dictator may be the incarnation of absolute power. He may be brutal, he may be terrible, but he is also, and this is the only way that I could think of putting it, a poor bastard. Okay, that's one way that I would describe him. So when it comes to this, when it comes to the pathetic episodes, look out for his feelings and his connection with his mother. Okay, his mother, Bendición Alvarado. At one point he starts a process because he wants her to be canonized. He wants her to be recognized as a saint. And then in that chapter, which is chapter 4 of the novel, you hear the story of primarily his mother and what happens to her. So look out for that and you'll see exactly what I mean when I say that this is a pathetic novel also, and that we get the image of a sensitive dictator. Now, I want to go back briefly to what Gabriel García Márquez said about Miguel Ángel Asturias's Mr. President, or El Señor Presidente. So once again, he said this novel was pésima. He said it was awful. Okay, this is often regarded as the first dictator novel, and I did a video on it actually. So if you want to hear more in detail about it, I read the latest English translation for El Señor Presidente also, and I tell you about that in that video. But in any case, Gabriel García Márquez did not specify why it was that he considered Mr. President to be an awful novel and awfully written. But I think we can offer a theory if we compare Mr. President to The Autumn of the Patriarch. We can get some ideas right there. What was the main difference? Okay, I want to go straight to the most important point to be brief about this, because this comparison could lead us to another video, basically. So the main difference is that in Mr. President, you get the figure of the dictator, which is a mythical figure. He is a type of god who demands sacrifice and blood. But here, you don't get a lot of the psychology of the dictator. Miguel Ángel Asturias does not really go inside, right, the mind of the dictator. In The Autumn of the Patriarch, on the other hand, Gabriel García Márquez really takes us into the mind, into the brain, into even the heart, I would say, of the dictator, to try to make us understand. This is a novel that is trying to respond to the question, why? Okay, why do dictatorships happen? Specifically in Latin America, but in the rest of the world too. What is behind this figure of the dictator? Why does somebody like this rise to power? And speaking of power, I think that The Autumn of the Patriarch is just a perfect illustration of the dynamics of power. Okay, power to me is a web in which everybody is caught, even the dictator himself. And that is why in a previous video, in the one on Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee, I told you that power is not really something that one has, but it is something that different people exercise to different degrees depending on the circumstances. I think, in addition, regarding this idea of power, right, that this novel is not just about power and the dynamics of power, but it shows that power can be, and in this case it is, in the Autumn of the Patriarch, a substitute for love. You can look at the idea of power in the Autumn of the Patriarch as a defense mechanism, as a type of compensation for something that is lacking in the life of the dictator. And it's going to sound maybe silly and simplistic when I say it. Okay, this is not, something that I'm trying to, summarize the novel here or anything like that. But I think the main problem, in many ways, that we have right here is an absence of love. Okay, I think this is also the connection with the concept of sadism and masochism in the dictator. We obviously think of dictators as sadistic, but what we tend to forget is that there's also a lot of masochism involved in the figure of the dictator. Let me read you a very important passage from this great book by Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom. Highly recommended, by the way. He says on page 220 of the edition that I have, "The essence of the authoritarian character has been described as the simultaneous presence of sadistic and masochistic drives. Sadism was understood as aiming at unrestricted power over another person, more or less mixed with destructiveness. Masochism as aiming at dissolving oneself in an overwhelmingly strong power and participating in its strength and glory. Both the sadistic and the masochistic trends are caused by the inability of the isolated individual to stand alone and his need for a symbiotic relationship that overcomes this aloneness." So we also have that concept of solitude right there, that concept of a character who is in need of relationship, of connection. Maybe you could even extend that to say of that love that is absent in the Autumn of the Patriarch. As I said before, I highly recommend this book. It's a book that can be very useful in understanding a text like the Autumn of the Patriarch and other texts, and even, I would say, our society as a whole. So given the history of Latin America, it's not surprising at all that dictator novels have flourished in this region. These novels are great, I do want to say that, but I think it's very important that we do not reduce Latin American literature to the dictator novel, to this type of work, okay? One of the reasons why I point this out is because of something that I read in a book that I have shown you before very recently on Nadine Gordimer, Conversations with Nadine Gordimer, when I did that video on July's People. And something that I found here, I read this a very long time ago, but it stuck with me because I thought it was a very interesting statement. She says, "I think in the case of Latin American countries, they seem to have experienced so many forms of oppression and for so long that it's become a normal state. But notice that they all write about the same thing. The themes are as obsessive as the African ones. The theme among the remarkable Latin American writers is the corrupt dictator. Nevertheless, despite the sameness of theme, I regard this as the most exciting fiction in the world being written today anywhere." And later on, a couple of lines below, she says, "Always there's this obsessive theme, the corrupt dictator. They all write about it. They're obsessed by it." And I think the specific part that stood out to me was this. Notice that they all write about the same thing. And later on, they all write about it. They're obsessed by it. Those are the lines that I thought about. And I think, words like all, like always, like everyone, like everybody, everything, I try to stay away from those because, especially when you're talking about interpretation, they hardly ever apply. These words are just too strong for what we are talking about. And I don't mean to put Nadine Gordimer on the spot. Gabriel García Márquez himself said that the dictator was the only mythological character that Latin America had produced. These are very strong statements. So once again, I just wanted to point this out. I think that the figure of the dictator is definitely prominent, is definitely important in Latin American literature, but I would say that it's not really all there is to it. Okay, these are generalizations. The same thing when you consider all of Latin American literature to be magical realism, right? it's not all about magical realism. It's not all about dictators. The problem sometimes is that when you're judging literature in translation, what we are getting in that case, and it happens to me too when I read literature of other countries, the languages of which I do not know and I cannot read, what I get is a selection, right? I get what has somebody decided was worth translating, and that responds to the market, to the conceptions that we have of other cultures and things like that. So I just wanted to bring this to the table to kind of highlight that idea. You know, the dictator, yeah, it's important. Dictator novels, yeah, we have quite a few of them, and they're important and they're great, but that's not all that there is to it. Let me ask you, what do you think about this? Okay, just write it in the comments if you have some ideas about this topic, because I think it's fascinating in itself, and it's another topic that we could talk about for a very long time. The last thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to compare The Autumn of the Patriarch very briefly to another Latin American novel, not to one of the dictator novels, but a different one. I want to make a connection with a novel that I made a video on very recently, and that is La Muerte de Artemio Cruz, or The Death of Artemio Cruz by Carlos Fuentes. There's a very close connection between the two characters, okay, Artemio Cruz and the Patriarch, and also between the two novels. You could say that both of these novels deal with a man who is dying, obviously, and they both deal with power and solitude. Maybe it's a different kind of power that we are talking about. One is a dictator, the other one is not. Is the kind of person who exercises power in a more, you know, non-governmental type of way, I think you could say. I think that if Artemio Cruz had become a head of state, if he had had the chance to exercise the kind of power that the Patriarch exercises, he might well have developed into somebody very, very similar to the Patriarch. You can feel that sadism, that masochism at work as kind of parallel drives behind these two characters. So I thought that was a very interesting connection between these two novels. And you could also say that The Death of Artemio Cruz has a kind of spiral structure. We keep coming back to the same thing, right? To that idea of Artemio Cruz dying and remembering all of these things and kind of assessing his life. So I thought that was a very interesting connection between the two of them. So the bottom line, stylistically speaking, The Autumn of the Patriarch is, I believe, Gabriel García Márquez's crowning achievement. This is him at his best. 100 Years of Solitude may be his most important novel, and it is actually the one that I would recommend to somebody who has never read García Márquez. If somebody came to me and said, Jorge, I have never read García Márquez, where should I start? I would never say The Autumn of the Patriarch. It could work, you know, but it's kind of a stretch. I would say read 100 Years of Solitude, and then after that you will probably be, you would probably have a better chance of enjoying something like The Autumn of the Patriarch. But I think among people who are already fans of Gabriel García Márquez, when you compare the two, The Autumn of the Patriarch may be the preferred text. And I would say, especially in this time when we are not as enthusiastic about magical realism, and I had to generalize here, right? But many of us are not, you know, as enthusiastic about magical realism as people were back in the 60s and 70s. So maybe that's something there that we can add to the mix. I absolutely loved The Autumn of the Patriarch in Spanish, and I loved it in English also in this great translation by Gregory Rabassa, the same guy, of course, who translated 100 Years of Solitude, Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar, and so many other great novels. So I'm really happy that I had the experience of the text in both languages. Now you may be saying, Jorge, the video is about to end and you have not quoted from The Autumn of the Patriarch. No, I have not, okay? From the very first page up to the very last one, I was thinking, I'm going to try to find a sentence or a passage that I can quote. But you know what? I feel that no single quote, or even 2 or 3 quotes, does justice to this work. Okay, I really want you to read it. So please read this work. It's very difficult to choose one passage and quote it and go for the wow factor. This is a book that really you have to read it from beginning to end, and then you can grasp what it is. So that's one of the reasons why I did not quote from the novel. So, do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? I'm always listening to you and very happy to respond to your comments. Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on El Otoño del Patriarca, or The Autumn of the Patriarch, which I consider to be Gabriel García Márquez's masterpiece. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.